right. When people find out what you do, what kind of questions do they always ask?
Well, for the last 20 years, I've been teaching classes, but not conventional university classes. So that's the common question. I live here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, so they automatically say, "Oh, are you a professor at the University of Tulsa?" Well, I am an adjunct, but most of my teaching is for oil industry classes overseas that are 5-day classes for geologists and engineers. And then another group of classes are for the oil operating companies, such as a BP or an ExxonMobil, where it's a generalized class that's 2 days, and it's for those that don't have geology or engineering degrees. But they know those geologists are off in those rooms with all those squiggly lines all over the wall of the data they're working with. And so I explain to people who might be supply chain, human resources, financial groups, answering their questions and giving them an overview of what geologists do. So that's the nature of the dominant teaching.
Okay, very interesting. Well, tell us more about your background, both your academic background and your spiritual background.
Well, let me start with the spiritual background because it's so significant in the context of being introduced to God's creation. I grew up on the campus of Messiah College, where my father was a chemistry professor. So I've known God as my creator since I was a child, since I could talk. And so growing up in that kind of home, I gave my life to Christ in somewhere 7, 8, or 9, something like that. And my dad baptized me in a local lake that was what was available in the context of the church where he was a pastor of an extension church away from our campus. So that was my setting growing up. And then as I progressed on through high school, I was keenly interested in chemistry. My dad and I got along very well. We did a lot of outdoor activities. So I went into chemistry, had my dad himself for my first 2 years of chemistry. And then I transferred out to Wheaton College in Illinois to complete a bachelor's degree in chemistry. So that's kind of my spiritual, and then leading right into my academic. All my training at both Messiah College and at Wheaton College, everything we did in examining creation was observing what God did and the way he put the earth together. So that's my whole frame of reference in terms of my spiritual and then academic background. Once I finished that at Wheaton College, then my department chairman and advisor, he encouraged me to go into geochemistry, which meant bringing geology into the mix. Well, I was kind of nervous about jumping straight in. So I took my first geology class in the Back Hills, and in that setting, I could be walking around with blue jeans and hiking boots and T-shirts and getting college credit for it. So that gave me the comfort level of jumping on into to geology then and geochemistry. So then as I eventually went to Columbia University in New York City, I selected a project in ocean chemistry. And my advisor sent me out in an oceanographic research vessel. And that gave me an opportunity to do some seeing a number of segments of the world through the lens of a research vessel on a ship. So that's what got me into my Ph.D. then eventually in geochemistry.
Ken, what was your introduction to creation science? Maybe not just young Earth, but the whole range of creation science. When did that come on your horizon?
In our setting at Messiah College and Wheaton College, I never heard of the creation science that's now known as young Earth creationism. It was not on my radar screen. So from my personal experience and frame of reference, it really didn't even exist in all of my contexts. I first became aware of it as I was finishing my PhD, and someone gave me the opportunity to see a copy of the book called The Genesis Flood by Whitcomb and Morris. And that was in 1970. So I was just finishing my degree and beginning to come off and teaching at a college. And that was my introduction. And I could tell within 4 to 5 hours of reading there that what we do in geochemistry just is not presented correctly in terms of what we actually do in the laboratory and how we understand things. So that was my introduction to this thing called scientific creationism.
And how did that springboard and lead you into the solid rock lectures?
Okay. Well, having that background and becoming aware that this, in fact, was a movement in the evangelical church, as I did my professional activities, I taught for 5 years at Dickinson College in central Pennsylvania. My wife and I moved to Brazil, and I was a visiting faculty member in northeastern Brazil in a graduate department there. When we returned to the United States, then I had the opportunity to get involved in the oil industry, and it was the oil industry then that brought me to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to work for the Amerada Hess Corporation. And so I got the context of the nature of, what the oil industry was like, working in it, appreciating the fact that these companies knew a lot about geology and a lot about geochemistry. And I really didn't pay any attention to the creation science material for 15 to 20 years. Gradually, I would hear things that were published by ICR, and I would see that they were scientifically invalid. And I would be fussing around the kitchen and sort of complaining to my wife, why do these people do this? And eventually she would say, when I had a couple of minutes of ranting about this, she would say, well, Ken, those folks get all the publicity because people like you are quiet and don't get involved, don't do anything. Honest people like you don't participate in the discussion. So after 15 to 20 years of those little comments that my dear wife would share with me, I finally had an event here in Tulsa that we had a workshop, and there was a architect who was presenting some material that he derived from one of the young earth creation organizations, and he didn't understand what was the nature of the science he was talking about. And at that point, the Lord just prompted me that I should get involved in some way. I began to prepare talks to give to churches. And then gradually, within a few years, that led to founding Solid Rock Lectures as an organization, basically to be able to present geological content to church settings, seminaries, and now recently I'm reaching out to the homeschool community.
Were you surprised, Doctor? I know Christians come in all varieties and all stripes, and we differ on many different things. That might come up in a question a little bit later. But were you surprised to find fellow geologists wrapped up in or invested in young earth creation?
Well, very much so, because although the individuals who wrote the Genesis Flood did not have the geology background, but in their organizations in ICR, they did hire some folks that did have PhDs in geology. So yes, that was very much of a surprise that they would get sort of tied up with this, basically a theology that requires the earth to be young. So everything they saw in creation was through that really tight filter. And so they ended up describing things and making claims that got spread across the church that are invalid and incorrect. So yes, it was a surprise.
So you were recently at the NCCA conference and gave a couple of presentations. Tell us a little bit about your presentations and the groups that were there, and maybe just a brief overview of this conference as well.
Yep. Well, the conference is one that's been going on in apologetics for, 20, 25 years. And about 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to give a breakout session, which got me introduced to the leadership and the folks there at Southern Evangelical Seminary that organize it. And out of that, I was able to have 2 breakout sessions in the conference this year, which was done online. And the first one, I referred to it as Creation Story to help to prepare homeschoolers and homeschool families for university science classes. So in that one, I covered 3 dominant sort of segments of evidence for an ancient Earth. The first one, I talked about the Pacific Ocean plate, which is moving slowly over a hot spot in the mantle, which has formed the Hawaiian Islands and a whole group of islands to the north and the northwest of Hawaii. The next topic that I talked about in that talk was radiocarbon dating and radiocarbon methods that we will talk a bit about here as we go on through some of the questions. And then the third topic that I shared was something that's really fairly easy to understand, and that is ice cores, because on Greenland, as the snow falls in the winter and the summer, geologists can detect that annual deposition of snow in the wintertime and sort of warming up in the summertime in the surface. So they can count that annual layering and look back into climate for about 100,000 years in that ice core. So those are the things that I covered in that one.
How was it received?
I felt my delivery went pretty well, but it was an unusual setting. And I noticed this with the other speakers too, is that there's a setting that there's nobody there to introduce you. So it's a little awkward getting started. But once I sort of got over that hurdle and got into my content material with my PowerPoint slides, my delivery went very smoothly. I do a little protection on that because typically I have my wife sitting somewhere just, on the side so that she can give me little clues. Am I going fast enough? Am I, and am I moving it along in a friendly and attractive kind of way? So that helps me. I had about 12 to 15 participants in both of the sessions. And in each case, 4 to 5 of the individuals responded back afterward, which I gave that invitation, and they asked for some content material to be sent to them, which I did. I did have one negative feedback from, there was one gentleman that was a very, very committed to young Earth creationism. So he gave the pushback that I think he wished he hadn't even sat in, but those things happen sometimes. The other talk was about the Grand Canyon. And in the Grand Canyon, I told about the history of the way the book was developed and why we did it and the audience for whom it was written. Talked about the dominant themes that we are presented in the Grand Canyon in terms of geologic methods, comparing the flood geology viewpoint with a contemporary geology viewpoint. Yeah, there's the book. And I have my copy here also. Right by, there we go. Get it on the camera a little bit. So, and likewise, same thing is that I had about 4 or 5 people who then sent me email messages for some additional information.
Ken, why is this even an issue? I've heard a number of people say, this isn't a tier 1 issue. It's tier 2 or tier 3. It doesn't affect a person's salvation. Why, over those 15 years, did you get disturbed at what you heard? Why did your wife have to prod you forward in this? Why solid rock lectures? What do you think is the harm in say, a grandmother believing the Earth is 6,000 years old and Christians believing that the Earth is young and we should read Genesis literally? Where's the harm in that?
Well, I have no problem with like a grandmother or somebody who's not involved with reaching out with apologetics to our culture to have a view that the earth is 6,000 years old, because indeed it's a tertiary issue. It's not related to salvation. It's not related to the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's not related to Christ's death on the cross. Although answers in Genesis and ICR make it that way by the things they say, such that they'll quote that if the earth is old, Christ's death on the cross is meaningless. Well, that's damaging then, because it communicates that there is something else that's significant to the gospel, that this age of earth becomes significant. The real damage happens when the community of scientists hear about this material and they hear talks and realize that the creation itself, or the earth as they know it, as they study it, is described inaccurately and incorrectly and in ways that are just sheer nonsense. Their own work that they do is abused. One of our colleagues, who was an author in our Grand Canyon book, said that he attended a session that was given by basically one of the scientific creationists. And he commented that he never heard so much misinformation packed into 1 hour, and that this speaker abused his own work that he has done on the Grand Canyon. So that's where the damage is. The other place we see damage is that when young people go to universities, and they see that, and if they have been raised in a very strict young earth church environment, they face a risk, and some do really have a serious crisis of faith. One such individual wrote to one of my colleagues that she was traumatized enough that she wants to know and hope that her faith is not a lie. So here was somebody at least connected with some of us who are Christian geologists who are willing to speak about it. The scientific community, if you want to think of an analogy, if any of us, see somebody walking down the street with placards, sandwich boards, which says the earth is flat, it's discarded. I had a conversation with 2 engineers in Russia, and they said, Christianity has no merit because those folks believe that the earth is 6,000 years old. Well, there I had the opportunity from that discussion that led to the point that I was able to give both of them copies of the Bible, and I affirmed with them that the Bible does not mandate that the earth is 6,000 years old. And most Christians do not believe that.
Well, this is a difficult question then. One of the first ones.
Go ahead.
From the AIG ICR perspective, it's not just a denial of geology, right? It's to hold that view, you're going to be at odds with modern biology, paleontology, in some cases, physics, plate tectonics, embryology. We could keep going on, right? Yep. Yeah. So with basically all of major science, and there's an atmosphere in, if you want to call it fundamentalism or American evangelicalism, that there's this built-in suspicion of the scientific community, that community you just mentioned. There's a built-in suspicion of people who have an expertise in a field. And if you talk to these people, young earth creationists, they almost suggest that these scientists have been blinded by the God of this world, right? So you have to almost believe in a conspiracy theory to hold creation science as something that's true to reality. On the other, in the other hand, you brought up the flat Earth thing. Okay, so what would you say about all these Christians, many of them who have a robust intellectual career in other areas who hold to this idea that somehow Satan has cast a spell on the world's scientists and they're living under that. In other words, what spell are they living under? Which side is right and which side is bewitched? Because to believe those things, there's going to be a lot of cognitive dissonance going on. So who am I to believe? Your side that says, what cloud are they living under? How do you explain that so many Christians, at least in this hemisphere, gravitate toward young earth creation? And how do you respond or refute their argument that you're just trying to make nice with the secular scientists and that they're blinded by the God of this world?
Well, ultimately it comes down to, does it matter? And the answer is yes, because truth always matters. And the challenge is the creation scientists who are, they're only, in terms of geologists, they're only about less than 10 who are writing in this area and have made a commitment to depart away from conventional geology in terms of applying sound scientific concepts and principles and processes based on the laws of chemistry and physics that God built into the creation. And they've made a choice to leave that arena and come over to an arena that was basically triggered initially by the Genesis flood. And then once organizations got started, then the church, beyond the couple of scientists who developed their stories very smoothly, they give a very convincing story. They have a sort of almost a nice little glass ball that seems to answer the questions. But in the middle of that ball, I can go down basically virtually all of those arguments and describe areas where they are nonsensical. So they have left that behind, and they've built an infrastructure with journals and videos and movies that are just tied up with misapplication of material. And it's painful to watch, but that's the nature of this situation in the evangelical church in the United States.
This may be a question you don't want to answer, because I'm seeing two groups then that you're mentioning in the young earth creation sphere, and that is the deceived, the layman who's listening to spiritual leaders, and the ones who, you said there's 10 or so geologists who are they being openly deceptive? I mean, would you say it's an open deception that they should know better? I mean, obviously the layman isn't going to know better. The layman's going to trust his pastor, his youth pastor, or, the latest apologist. But are you saying that there's an open deception, at least with some of these people, that they're clearly stepping away from standards that they embrace to get their Ph.D. or what have you?
I concur with you 100% that I lay no blame whatever at the feet of those that don't have a science background, because the story is told so well. It's told with very slick movies and excellent presentations and videos and things. So that's done extremely well. The challenge is, I don't know what prompts those few people to abandon basically what I view as their integrity and go make up these things. Probably the best example is the potassium argon that's done on Mount St. Helens. Potassium argon absolutely cannot be used on rocks that are very, very young, that have just erupted from a volcano, because the step is that potassium-40 atoms decay away to argon-40 atoms. And for that clock to work, it absolutely has to have about 50 to 100,000 years for enough argon to have been formed that can be measured in the laboratory. In the case of Mount St. Helens, it was an explosive event, and there were rocks that were carried up to the surface. So the measurements already had argon in them before those rocks came up to the surface. That is, the timer had not been reset to 0 time, but these folks communicate to the church with this mantra: if we can't trust the ages of those that we know that these rocks have erupted as a volcano, how can we trust any others? And that is a message of, that's a deceiving message that they communicate to the church. I can't answer the question of why those individuals do that. That you'll have to find a psychologist or psychiatrist. I do not understand it.
So I know this year with COVID-19 and how many schools are struggling with hybrid plans or online plans, that a number of families have opted to homeschool this year for the first time. And I heard the number is about doubling the number of homeschool families. You mentioned having a heart for homeschool families. I really do too. I have such a concern that many families are starting this homeschool journey and don't have a science background to evaluate different curriculum. Maybe they just select a curriculum that seems like it's a good package for them, or their friends are using it, or the co-op is using it. What kind of advice do you have for families when they're beginning this journey and maybe they're a little bit overwhelmed, or they're getting started and they haven't considered the scientific aspect of the quality of curriculum that they're selecting? What would you say to these families?
Well, I inevitably have to alert them that if it comes from the Young Earth organizations, most of the material will be fine. But when they come to the components of, say, the age of the Earth and understanding geology, there will be some things there that are incorrect. So they'll have to address that. I would encourage them to address that issue. Now, as we speak, particularly for the biology side, BioLogos has just launched an online program called Integrate, where I had the opportunity to be looking at the material related to geology. And so there's some material that is available online, or gradually will be available online, that I can vouch for, that will be credible and solid with the sciences. Another that I know that is in place to be able to have homeschool curriculum related to science that has good, solid integrity is the Charlotte Mason Institute. They're also developing courses that are designed for homeschool families that will stay true to good, solid, credible science. In this process, I also want to mention that if any of these families are connected with Christian schools, that there is now a textbook available. It's called Earth Science. It's written by a geology friend of mine. And this is being used at quite a number of Christian schools. So that is a location that, that if they're using this, the publisher of that is Classical Academic Press. So that kind of a book is available in that setting.
How about Novare, Science and Math?
That is the same one I'm talking about. Novare was recently bought by Classical Academic Press. So Novare is in fact the one.
Okay, good. I've heard of them.
And then another group that I should mention for good, solid, credible science is the Reasons to Believe group with Hugh Ross and his colleagues in California. So that has good, solid tech. But they let's see, they're very much into good, solid scientific apologetics and cover lots of different subjects, but they have not had the opportunity and put the effort in to develop specifically homeschool content material. They had some overtures of planning to do so a few years ago, but other priorities sort of took preference over that. But they're a good source for certainly for parents.
So you and Greg Davidson wrote an article in the Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith journal.
Yeah.
This is the volume 70, number 2, June of 2018. And the article is Testing and Verifying Old Age Evidence, Lake Sujitsu Varves, Tree Rings, and Carbon-14. That's a mouthful. So tell us about this article. Tell us, and let's, give us an overview to define terms, like what are varves, and how would this help us understand the age of the Earth?
Yeah, glad to do so. Now, I will say straight up front that this article is not related to the age of the Earth, because ultimately radiocarbon is only suitable for 50,000 years. But in terms of a methodology, it's good for this recent history of the Earth. Well, I'll start with the way you asked that question. That is, what are varves? Varves are sediments in certain kinds of lakes that have light and dark bands based on winter and summer deposition of sedimentary material. And let me give you an example of a scenario, just do a word description of where this could happen. Think of a lake in northern Minnesota that is frozen over in the wintertime. So in the wintertime, it's the fine clay and mud that's in the water column that's going to settle to the bottom. Then in the summertime and in the spring, when the leaves begin to come out, plants begin to grow, and species of microscopic organisms begin to grow in the water, then a light color of sediment of those species of organisms fall to the bottom. So there's alternating light and dark bands. So that's what a varve is, and that's the significance of it being, say, an annual layer that we can use and count passage of years. So that's the start. Step on with the next question.
All right. So what's the main topic of this article if it's not about the age of the Earth?
Well, it's application of radiocarbon for 50,000 years. So it indicates that the Earth is older than 6,000 years, but it doesn't tie into the age of the Earth, because that comes from long half-life isotopes that are suitable to basically giving ages of igneous rocks in the millions of years, but that's not radiocarbon. So the theme of this article was to describe how radiocarbon dating is done and how it's derived from a mixture of data from the varves that you asked the definition of what they are, and from tree rings that are growth rings of trees. And the concept of radiocarbon is that carbon-14 is produced in the upper atmosphere by cosmic rays bombarding the Earth. That carbon-14 gets taken up in carbon dioxide. The trees take up that carbon dioxide as they do photosynthesis. And so carbon-14 gets into the rings of the trees each year as the trees grow. And then for plants are eaten by animals. So animals that are eating the grass that's out in the pasture land, animals will get carbon-14 into their bones. So radiocarbon dating, ultimately, then once we've developed, and I've talked a little bit more about the methods, are suitable to be able to get an age of, say, wood, bone, charcoal, things like that. And when I give more formalized talks completely with PowerPoint slides continuously, I show examples of the application for Hezekiah's tunnel that was built by Hezekiah. So that's a place where radiocarbon can be used. And also for the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls have been dated by radiocarbon. So that's the concept and the theme of the article. So it's an integration of tree rings and the amount of carbon that's in the tree rings, sedimentary varves and the amount of carbon that's in the sedimentary varves, and then the radiocarbon that's measured in those can give us ages.
From a young Earth perspective, they read Genesis as special creation, and that Adam was created as like a 30-year-old man, right? I mean, that's kind of the argument they make. So he was only 1 day old, but he was already a man in their perspective. And I think that they understand it, other than, you mentioned Hugh Ross and OTB. The young Earth perspective is that the trees were created and fully formed. They weren't a sapling, and that the chicken was before the egg, right? And so they appeared to have age. Another argument they'd present with what you just said is you're relying completely on materialist explanations of the age of these things. And so you're straying from the authority of the Word of God and dismissing the idea that God works in miraculous ways. So it was a miracle, possibly, much like the resurrection of Jesus was a miracle, and you don't seem to be putting that into your calculations. How do you respond to that?
Yeah. First, I come back and I think about, with respect to Scripture, I realize that the most significant miracle that was presented in Scripture, which we first think of the resurrection, but when you dig a little deeper and you think about it, the greatest miracle really was Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So creating everything, absolutely everything, space, time, energy, and matter, created out of nothing, ex nihilo, that defines God as the creator of the universe and all the laws of nature that go along with it. So my firm presupposition through all of my scientific study is God is creator, and I am just taking the opportunity to learn what he has built into his creation in the event right there in Genesis 1:1 and successive, a broad brush look at the history of the earth with the chapter Genesis 1. So I don't see this scientific study as a materialistic effort. I see it as basically what Johannes Kepler said, to look at the regular order and harmony that has been imposed on the whole creation by our Creator, by God. So that's my frame of reference, that they're not materialistic. Materialism itself or naturalism has no inherent power. God is behind everything.
All right, so tell us more from the article about how you use these tree rings and these varves and carbon-14 to check on each other and confirm that each is, like, the tree rings are annual versus more frequent than annual, or that the varves really are laid annually.
Yeah. Okay, if you go ahead, John, please put up one of those early slides that I shared with you, and we'll step through some of those as some examples. The first step is what is referred to as cross-dating. So back up one with the photo of the and make that photo of the cores of the tree ring cores. Make that a little bigger. Is here that one of the trees that's on the right-hand side of the screen, that is from a living tree. Then the next segment of the tree is one that comes from the log cabin. And what we do in cross-dating is we tie the wide and narrow bands of wet and dry seasons of the tree that's in the cabin to the tree that is living. And therefore, we can do a count back into time beyond the time that the living tree is there. So we can connect dead trees successively back in time and make that kind of a count. Now, in this slide, the two solid blue lines in the middle are ones that would be we could expect the radiocarbon to be in tree rings if the following criteria have been satisfied. That is, if we understand the nature of the production of carbon-14 up in the atmosphere, that in fact, tree rings on average do grow at one ring per year, and that the half-life of radiocarbon is what we measure in the laboratory today at 5,370 years, 5,730 years, results would fall between those two dark lines in the middle of the slide. Now, young Earth creationists often will tend to say, well, there could be many tree rings generated per year in the way trees grow. And that does happen with some species. But if that happened predominantly, the final results of actually measuring trees out in nature would fall outside that line, that is the yellow line where I referenced there as many trees, many rings per year. If in fact there were far less carbon-14 in the atmosphere than we understand there to be, or if decay rates went much faster, then the path of real data from nature would fall below those lines, following the red. Let's go to the next one now, please, John. The other thing that the radiocarbon in the tree rings can help us is to do that cross-matching, that cross-dating correctly. If it is done, if we have made the understanding of the dead tree to the living tree, that those rings were formed by the growing trees in the same year, from the dead tree to the living tree, they would have to match each other precisely as shown on this slide. So that's a confirmation that we've in fact made a correct decision on doing the cross-dating. Then the next slide. Now, this is the actual data from 14,000 years of tree ring count that laboratories in Germany have done with the European, or with the German oak species. Okay, so you'll see that the red line of tree ring data falls nicely within those expectations. This means we do understand the relationship of how much carbon-14 is produced in the upper atmosphere. The radioactive decay rate is, in fact, then 5,730 years. And the tree rings are, in fact, on average, growing at one ring per year. So we're getting a credible selection of data. Do you have questions about that step before I go on with barbs?
Are there any assumptions that you've had to make, and how do you test that your assumptions are accurate?
Well, I have, in a sense, I've made the assumption of the understanding, the criteria. I prefer to use the word criteria than assumption for deliberate reasons. Turns out assumption is a belief in something without evidence, or without something is true without evidence or without confirmation. Well, we're testing those, so I call them criteria. That's okay. So with that graph that I've shown you, we've verified that on average there's one tree ring grown per year, and that the radioactive half-life is consistent with our measurement in the laboratory of 5,730 years. So we've covered that with that graph that I showed you with the red line within those two darker lines. The other thing you will see is that red line is somewhat squiggly, okay, inside those two bands. It's squiggly because the production of radiocarbon in the upper atmosphere varies with the cosmic ray flux. So when you blow this up, you're able to see the nature of some of that variation. We'll go ahead and step on to VARVs now as this next one comes up. Go ahead, John. There we go. Okay. Now, the red line represents the 14,000 years for tree rings. That's the longest that we can do a trustworthy cross-dating process. Beyond that time, we then look to sedimentary VARVs in Lake Geologist, which are described in our paper and the process of how we do that. If, in fact, the VARVs were many VARVs per year or many couplets of those light-dark bands, if lots and lots happen every year, then the data would fall above that two dark bands that I showed was our estimated if all the criteria were suitably met. Or if decay rate were faster in the past, then the data would fall below the line as on that lower green line. So there's a way that we're testing the viability of and the criteria, are these VARVs actually annual? Okay, step on to the next one. If there's some missing VARV, a missing VARV section that we've missed significantly amounts, then the data would also fall outside those lines of expectations. Okay, and the next one. And the next one. The actual data, okay, and blow this one up then. The actual data from 120 feet of core that have been collected from sediments in Lake Geologist in Japan, which has a very unique setting that are this many years of accumulation of those sedimentary VARVs. And we described the process in the paper that Kristine showed you. Notice now that the green circles go right on back to 50,000 years that are within that expected range, meaning that, yes, these VARVs on average are in fact representing passage of 1 year per light-dark cycle that we can observe in the cores. So that's a great piece of confirmation. And the one on the slides, go ahead and show the next one also, please. Now, one of the arguments that is heavily made by creation scientists that Noah's flood changed everything 4,500 years ago from the biblical time range of when we'd anticipate that Noah lived. If, in fact, Noah's flood deposited most of the sediments, for example, in the Grand Canyon and elsewhere, okay, any place that we find samples with radiocarbon in them, such as tree rings, bones, et cetera, once we get back to 4,500 years, after that time, the whole way back, all the values should show up as 4,500 years, if that's when all these sediments were deposited. But in fact, that's not the case. So thousands of layers were not laid down in the flood 4,500 years ago. And likewise, the tree rings beyond 4,500 years ago still show that those trees were living back to 14,000 years. And then the sedimentary VARVs in the lake were deposited on back to 50,000 years. And actually, the record even goes deeper, estimated to about 100,000 years. So that's the testing process of verifying the criteria or the assumptions as you state it in that way.
So what about things like carbon inside of diamonds? How can carbon still be found inside of diamonds if that was a process?
Notice that we're using 3 different methodologies to get information about time. We're looking at the content of the carbon-14, we're using the count of tree rings, and we're using the count of VARVs. So here are 3 totally independent behaviors that God has given us. We have the radioactive decay, we have biology, which is the growth of tree rings, and we have geology, which is the sedimentation process of varves in Lake Suigetsu, and they all can be fit together nicely as a coherent story. Okay, to the next one. This is the one that I included to talk about diamond. All measurements in the laboratory that are done for radiocarbon dating are using what's called an accelerated mass spectrometer technology. That process can detect extremely small amounts of carbon-14 compared to carbon-12. So this slide, I'm showing a piece of graphite that has been found that it's understood to be extremely old, that is far older than 100,000 years. And if the graphite is put into the AMS, accelerated mass spectrometer, I'm just going to say AMS, it's put into the AMS equipment, it can detect the amount of carbon that is shown on that lower number there, 0.003 of the amount of carbon that is in the atmosphere today. But diamonds have to be treated with harsh chemicals to convert the diamond mineral into graphite before it can be used in the AMS equipment. So all samples of bone, tree rings, or a tree material, wood material, charcoal, clay, Dead Sea Scrolls, all have to be treated to convert the carbon that's in those materials to graphite before it can be put into the AMS equipment for measurement. So all that chemical processing is done by acids and bases in the laboratory, and fluids in the laboratory have some radiocarbon because the liquids have absorbed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It's impossible. Somebody just in the laboratory, there's carbon around the laboratory because we have carbon dioxide. So the result after the chemical processing, as shown in this example, that the graphite after the treatment ends up having 0.33 or 35% modern carbon in the atmosphere. So basically, every measurement that's done in the laboratory has this background of about 100 times more than can be physically detected by that super-sensitive AMS equipment. So that's dominantly what is, those people that work in the laboratory day after day after day, they recognize the fact that this is where the carbon is being detected. And then one more slide shows also the nature of the background. So the lowest line there is the limits of detection that I mentioned a few moments ago, 0.003. Background is from 0.2 to about 0.4, are the red dots over to the right. And then the green dots there at about 50,000 years to 55,000 years. Those are the sedimentary varves that were down at the base of that core that was collected from Lake Suigetsu. So that's basically background that's being reported and talked about by the young Earth creationists who want to discredit radiocarbon dating.
So do you feel like radiocarbon dating and radiometric dating in general is a useful tool and generally very reliable?
When the methods are applied correctly, and I've shown some examples when they're not applied correctly. When they're applied correctly by people who have studied them and they know the methods and can detect where there are problems that might come up with contamination, they can be reliable and credible results. And I once looked through the Geological Society of America bulletin for about a year, and I just quickly looked at how many of the articles had some reference to radiometric dating as geologists were doing their work. In my recollection, it was like 30 to 40% of the articles when they were talking about some area of geology where there are igneous rocks involved include radiometric dating methodologies. So there are literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these measurements made over the history of that over the last number of decades. So yes, they have good, solid credibility. And on the geologic time scale that you see anywhere where the numbers are given in terms of millions of years, those are very well established by dozens and dozens and dozens of repeated measurements.
I'd also point out, too, that there's a cost involved to using this process. And if scientists didn't find them valuable or likely to be accurate, they would not continue to use this process. I know in my business, right, I would never be permitted to continue development on a product if the cost didn't yield a good result, a
meaningful result. Exactly. Yep.
Right. So you are one of the authors on this really beautiful book on the Grand Canyon, Monument to the Ancient Earth. What was your involvement in this book? Tell us about, just give us a little overview of the book and the collaboration of so many people on it, and where we could get a copy.
Okay. The book was triggered by a geologist named Carol Hill, and she'd been doing research in the Grand Canyon for many years, and she became aware that younger flood geology community has been taking Christians and theologians down through the canyon for many years, sharing a story that had also the story that the Grand Canyon was formed by Noah's flood within a year or so of 4,500 years ago. And that disturbed her as a practicing geologist. And so she contacted myself and Steve Moser at Wheaton College and Greg Davidson at Ole Miss. Said, we need to do a book about the Grand Canyon in response to this stream of books that had been published by Canyon Ministries and ICR regarding the canyon that included this concept of Noah's flood. And there's a lot of writing in the young Earth community about these, and numbers of books have been published. So we agreed together that we needed to have some major topics covered. Carol was able to make arrangements to have one of the editors as someone who lives in Flagstaff, Arizona, and is at a university there, and he does a lot of his own work in the Grand Canyon, and he has his own book in the Grand Canyon bookstore. So he became one of the editors, Wayne Ranney, and that gave us good links in because we ultimately wanted to have a book that we could have sold in the Grand Canyon bookstore. Then Carol looked beyond Steve Moser and Greg and myself. We looked for people who could have help with individual topics regarding the book. So Joel Duff handled a certain segment of certain types of fossils. And a professor from the University of Northern Arizona handled those kind of fossils that come from tracks, imprints, and tracks of animals. One of the editors took the effort to find the endless number of professional photographs and tracking down suitable photographs to make this a strongly and well done book photographically. And my role was significantly, I became basically, I was managing the process of raising some funding because we wanted to find enough funds so that this book could be sold to available for, say, for pastors, for homeschool parents, sort of in the range of at least under $30, because 250-page book full of color, if we did direct demand printing, would be 50 or 60, and we didn't want that. So I contacted lots of my oil field friends and gradually was able to raise enough money so that we were able to handle the layout, ultimately handled the printing of the book, and were able to, and then because of the connection with that gentleman that had his own books in the Grand Canyon bookstore, we have it there. And I remember one of the interesting conversations that I had with one of the photographers to whom we paid some royalties for his book, for his photographs. When I sent him the copies, he made a comment about the book, says, like, "Oh, wow, this is a beautiful book." I said, "I'm sensing you thought it might be a second or third tier book." He said, "Yeah, that's what I was expecting." So anyway, we're very pleased. The Lord really blessed us with a team of people that worked well together. The book is written expressly for the church. That was our mission. It's a geology book. We don't concentrate on understanding, the significance of Noah's flood in Genesis. We concentrate on the geology of the flood geology viewpoint in contrast to contemporary geology. And that's our mission for the book, to help people be able to have the data themselves that they can examine and look at to make an assessment if is this canyon formed by Noah's flood or not.
Doctor, it is really a beautiful book.
There you're showing the picture of Mount St. Helens that we have.
Yeah, it's just filled with beautiful, beautiful pictures. I highly recommend it. You can see about how thick it is. Lovely coffee table book. It far exceeded my expectations in the beautiful pictures and illustrations.
One of the things that I was very concerned about is that I really wanted a description of the strata in some place that would be inside the back cover. And as we were getting very close to the end, it almost looked as though I was not going to make that. And I was kind of disappointed. Are we going to get it there? Well, then the way you print books, they have to be printed with segments of 16 pages, plus or minus 16 pages. So we came up and we had about 5 pages available near the end of the book that we could had the opportunity to fill in some things. So there's a professor from University of Utah, Brigham Young University, who has some of the very best wide range photographs of the Grand Canyon area. So we were able to get permission from his family to use some of his. And I got my Grand Canyon stratigraphy right inside the back cover, which I was thrilled at.
Yeah, turned out really nice.
Yeah, we're thankful. In some ways, when we were finally done, I think all of us were amazed at how well the Lord sort of pulled the team together. But there was a lot of chasing back and forth. And the greatest credit really goes to Greg Davidson, because he had a sabbatical leave, which gave him the time to take these papers from 11 different authors with different perspectives and took everything apart and put it back together in a very coherent, very, very coherent story.
Doctor, when a young Earth creationist hears your argument, or the argument of other old Earth creationists, and they ask the question, is Genesis history, and they hear you dismissing Genesis as history, at least as far as the age of the Earth or cosmology or possibly the flood, Noah's flood, and even something like the Tower of Babel, the first 11 chapters of Genesis. If their common rejoinder to is that if you can't trust the first 11 chapters of Genesis, how are you going to trust the Gospels? And so they make the argument that this is not a question of the age of the earth. This is a question of the authority of the Bible.
Yeah. It's a very good question, and I take it very, very seriously. In fact, I am completely committed to the authority of the scriptures. All right. I notice that the young earth community makes the claim the earth is 6,000 years old. And I think R.C. Sproul gave the right answer. He said, I don't know how old the earth is because the Bible doesn't tell us. So what's happened is they've ignored, in my opinion, they have ignored Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2. They just skip those, okay? Which is a reason that I can't understand. But that's their interpretation of the way they choose to handle Genesis. The other thing is the word day, as it's used in Genesis, in Hebrew, as in English, yom can be 12 hours of daylight. It can be 24 hours from sunset to sunset, and it can be a long period of time. And I'm with Hugh Ross on this and that, and the rest of our basically Christian geologists recognize that that is a description of history that the yom means a long period of time, and that fits very well with the geologic record. The best book on this summary that talks about that whole history of from a perspective of a physicist is a book called The Creator Revealed. I don't know where I can get this. There I go. The Creator Revealed, a physicist looks at Genesis and the Big Bang. It's written by Professor Michael Strauss at University of Oklahoma. And it is a very good book in the sense that it's written for the layperson. It's not written for, just for a high-level scientist. But it's a very, very nice summary of a brief overview of the history of the universe and the history of the Earth in a broad brush view, and then doesn't have a lot about the geology other than the gradual buildup of continents once plate tectonics got started for the Earth.
He's a physicist.
All right. And what is your experience when members of the church, particularly students, are taught that part of defending Christianity is arguing against modern science, like against Big Bang cosmology or the long time scales of geology or even evolution?
Well, I seek to emphasize that I share the fact that one of my presuppositions, which I've already said, is that God is the creator of everything, both space, matter, time, and energy. And he's also a sustainer of his universe. So he sustains the earth continuously by the laws that he built into it. So God is the author of Scripture as special revelation, and he is the author of his world, which is general revelation. So a presupposition that I have that's critical is they both have to somehow fit together in harmony. So that is a really important step, because God can't lie. He can't be telling us one thing in Scripture and something different from what we see in nature. They must fit together. So Greg and I frequently say that for us, science cannot trump Scripture, but science can guide us back to Scripture to see what it actually says and what is really, really there in terms of what suitable exegesis is proper, in the sense that this book the Bible was written to the Hebrews as an ancient Near East culture. And what is the intended message? The intended message is it's written, the Bible is still written for us in the 21st century, but it's not written to us. It was written to them back there. So what should we be learning from it for us today? And it's not a science text. It's a fabulous, exalted prose story of the early history of the universe. And that's what I seek to try to get across, that they have to be thinking of them together.
Dr.
R.C. Sproul made a very good point. When I heard him in this panel, he said, if they seem to conflict, either the scientists are wrong or the theologians are wrong. Well, back in the days of Galileo, the theologians did get it wrong. They do get it wrong sometimes. Could we be wrong today? Somebody is, because the earth is not both old and young. So one is true and one is false. And that's what we have to wrestle with today.
Doctor, one of the criticisms we received on an earlier show of ours, I think it was one of the shows we did with John Walton and about the ancient Near Eastern relationship to Genesis, was that it was from a skeptic, and he wrote that every time science makes progress in an area, you Christians have to rewrite your theologies. In a sense, if that's the case, aren't we arguing as Christians that the Bible is not falsifiable? And isn't that kind of a breach of the scientific method in a way?
Go ahead and repeat the question again. I'm trying to process it because that's an unusual question.
One of the critiques we received from a skeptic was every time science makes some kind of progress in a field. For example, you mentioned Galileo. You Christians, he wrote, have to rewrite your theologies so it comes in line with modern science. It's actually a critique shared by young Earth creationists that say the same thing about what they would call progressive creationists. Yeah. So if that's the case, if that's something Christians are doing that that we try and find concordance between the two books, as you were mentioning, doesn't that make our view unfalsifiable? In other words, if science finds something different tomorrow and we rework our theologies in that way, is that a critique of what you just mentioned about the two books?
I do not think that the days of Galileo or are wrestling with these issues today with respect to the age of the earth and evolution have any changes to the core critical doctrines of the Christian faith. All right? It changes some understanding of what we actually saw in Scripture at times and say, well, is it really there? Well, the phraseology in Galileo's day that the earth would not be moved meant along the lines of, I am stable, I am not moved in terms of my relationship with God. It was not referencing the physical motion of the earth. Likewise, today, an old earth view is consistent with the Genesis account if you include everything, and the issue is not, it is not the matter of the age of the earth, which is really very tertiary, does not impact the core doctrines, the doctrine of creation, the doctrine of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the doctrine of the Trinity, and these core doctrines that make up the real roots of. So those kind of pushbacks do happen. They may always happen, but I don't see the core doctrines changing from the early creeds of the church or any creeds of the church.
What advice would you give to youth pastors and youth leaders and parents in talking about science and faith within the church or within small groups or youth groups to help students as they transition from, say, high school to college, where they are going to be exposed to higher level science and, the vast majority of universities, including Christian universities, are going to be teaching these modern science, geology, biology, and not young earth creation.
Yeah. This is one of the areas that I think Michael Strauss, the physicist, really did a nice job in his book on The Creator Revealed. He has a table, and the table includes some of the critical points related to young earth creation, creationists, old earth creationists, and evolutionary creationists, compared then with naturalists. Okay? So theologically, the first three are, in fact, connected directly with the belief and the doctrine that God is the creator of everything. And old earth creationists and evolutionary creationists have a perspective on science that is compatible with science and scripture. So it's suitable there in terms of understanding. So I would strongly encourage young youth pastors to have their young people be exposed to old earth creation and evolutionary creation as legitimate understanding of being a faithful, Bible-believing Christian, and to have good scientific apologetics.
You mentioned growing up that you weren't really familiar with the whole creation science thing, and it was later in life that you collided with it. Are you struck? Does it strike you odd that it seems to be pretty pervasive, at least in some corners of the Western world? I mean, in the 21st century, when science has really made great gains in the rest of the world, are you surprised that there's still this corner of Christianity that's so, forgive me, but backwards?
I am surprised. When I was first exposed to the Genesis flood, there was enough material in there that did not fit reality, that I really didn't think that it would catch hold the way that it has, and I was completely wrong. So yes, I'm surprised. And in fact, one time I was over teaching a petroleum engineering class in Abu Dhabi, and I was mixing with, I would usually worship at a evangelical church or a Protestant church if I could find one, if I was there over the weekend. And that developed into a situation where I was invited to some place for dinner, and there was another geologist there who was British. And he said to me, what's happened in the United States that it's become so anti-science? And I couldn't give a good answer. This is a phenomenon that's related, and it has its roots that still go back to the trial in Dayton, Tennessee, the Scopes trial. So there's something about our cultural milieu here in the United States that is very prone to be willing to accept this kind of material. It was a surprise to me, the component that has the problematic science from my frame of reference was really birthed in 1961 because with publication of the Genesis flood. So it's very powerful. It's very powerful.